looked like she was auditioning for a TV courtroom drama, complete with a stiff blazer and pearl earrings. She avoided eye contact, instead flipping through a binder so aggressively it was a miracle the pages didn't tear. The judge entered, and as soon as the formalities were over, Karen launched into a speech about how I had willfully ignored community bylaws, endangered residents, and set a dangerous precedent by refusing to cooperate. Her voice carried that tone she always used when she thought she was delivering some unassailable truth, and she even gestured toward a stack of printed HOA meeting minutes as if they were ironclad legal documents. When it was our turn, Hank stood, calm and deliberate, and began by introducing the county property map into evidence. He then handed over certified copies of my deed, the county assessor's reports, and letters from the county attorney's office confirming that the HOA had no authority over the road, the gate, or the land surrounding them. You could practically hear the air deflate from Karen's side of the room as the judge flipped through the papers. But Hank wasn't done. He then produced receipts and budget statements from the HOA's own publicly available records showing that funds had been allocated for vehicle damage repairs, suspiciously close to the date of Karen's spike trap encounter. When the judge asked Karen to explain, she stammered something about community emergencies, but Hank pressed the point that these were HOA funds, collected from all residents, being used to cover her personal expenses. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd of spectators, a few of whom I recognized from the neighborhood, and I caught one board member in the back narrowing his eyes at Karen like he'd just been told his bank account had been drained. The judge's questions became sharper, her tone less patient, and it was clear she didn't appreciate being asked to sort through a dispute that should never have been filed in the first place. By the time the judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning they couldn't file the same nonsense again, Karen's face was locked in a tight, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The judge made a point of noting on the record that my property rights were absolute and that any future attempts to interfere could carry legal consequences. As we walked out, I heard two board members arguing quietly in the hallway, one of them saying, "She told us it was a sure thing," and the other muttering about wasted HOA funds. Hank clapped me on the shoulder and told me this was one of the easiest wins he'd had all month, but I was already thinking ahead. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a fracture in Karen's power base. She had led the HOA into a public defeat, and now there was doubt, and doubt was poison to someone who thrived on unquestioned authority. Later that afternoon, Linda dropped by with a fresh pie and an even fresher update. She told me the HOA's private group chat was in chaos, with half the members demanding Karen step down as president and the other half defending her with increasingly flimsy arguments. Apparently, one particularly loud supporter had even left the chat after someone posted a copy of the court's ruling with the words, "Waste of our money," highlighted in yellow. It was exactly the kind of slow unraveling I had hoped for, the kind that wouldn't just end the current fight but make it nearly impossible for her to mount another one with the same level of backing. Still, if there was one thing I had learned about Karen, it was that she didn't back down gracefully. Losing in court wasn't going to end this. If anything, it was going to drive her to more desperate measures. I could almost picture her at home, pacing in her kitchen with that pinched expression, flipping through every rule book she could find to figure out how to hit me next. But I had something now that I hadn't before, a public record, a legal ruling, and a fractured HOA leadership. Every step she took from here would be harder, riskier, and more likely to backfire. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the last bit of daylight fade over the gate she had failed to touch, I knew the fight wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted, and she was going to have to run uphill from here while I stayed exactly where I was, waiting for her next move. It was just after midnight a week later when the motion sensor lights at the front of my property snapped on, flooding the gate and driveway with harsh white light, and I knew immediately that something was wrong because I hadn't been expecting anyone, and the quiet hum of the crickets outside was suddenly broken by the faint crunch of gravel under slow, deliberate footstep. I slipped out of bed, pulled on a jacket, and moved to the side window where the camera monitor was already showing me exactly what I thought it might. Karen, dressed in dark clothes like some low-budget cat burglar, crouching near the base of my gate with what looked like a canvas tote bag and a flashlight clenched between her teeth. I watched as she pulled out a roll of caution tape, a half-dozen small cardboard boxes, and something that looked suspiciously like a bottle of spray paint, working with a clumsy urgency that told me she wasn't just trespassing, she was planting something she could use later to accuse me of illegal activity. I didn't need to guess her plan. This was Karen's escalation play, her attempt to manufacture evidence that I was running some kind of unauthorized business operation from my property, the kind of accusation that could send the HOA into another frenzy if she had photos to back it up. She moved quickly, sticking handwritten labels to the boxes. I caught the words hazardous and unregistered in her looping handwriting, and then placing them carefully in a row near the gate. It might have looked convincing to someone passing by, but she had no idea my cameras were catching every second in crystal clarity from 3 different angles. I considered calling Sheriff Daniels right away, but then I realized it would be even better to let her hang herself completely before I made the call. I switched on the audio feed, and could hear her muttering under her breath, rehearsing the story she was going to tell. She was saying things like, "This will get him shut down for sure," and "no one runs a business in this neighborhood without going through me," and I knew she was so wrapped up in her scheme that she didn't even think about the fact that the security lights and cameras were essentially spotlighting her every move. She pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of the scene she had staged, making sure to get shots from multiple angles, even climbing halfway up the fence to get a better view. That was when Mark, who had been staying over in the guest room that night after a late fishing trip, walked into the living room half awake and asked why the lights were on. When I showed him the monitor, his eyes lit up and he grinned in a way that told me he was already thinking about how satisfying it would be to confront her in the act. We decided to go together, partly because I wanted a witness and partly because Mark's presence had a way of making Karen's bravado crumble just a little. I grabbed my phone, started recording from the porch, and flicked the deadbolt open loud enough for the sound to carry across the driveway. Karen froze mid-step, flashlight beam jerking wildly before she turned toward us with a startled look that quickly morphed into a fake, cheerful smile. She tried to spin some nonsense about how she was investigating a community safety concern and had discovered suspicious materials on my property, but the fact that she was standing inside my gate with my security lights blazing down on her and a tote bag of evidence still at her feet made the lie about as thin as it could be. Mark stepped forward, picking up one of the boxes and flipping it over to reveal that it was completely empty except for a crumpled grocery receipt dated 3 weeks ago. I told her calmly that she was being recorded from multiple angles, both on the cameras and on my phone, and that she had exactly 2 choices: leave immediately and wait for the sheriff to come to her house in the morning, or stay put and explain her actions to him in person right now. Her face flickered between defiance and panic, and for a moment I thought she might actually try to double down, but then she caught sight of Mark holding up another box and reading the word hazardous with an exaggerated level of mock concern. That seemed to break whatever script she had been running in her head, and she muttered something about just trying to help before turning to leave. That was when I made the call to Daniels anyway, because there was no way I was letting her sneak off without the incident being logged officially. Daniels answered groggily, but perked up immediately when I told him Karen had been caught trespassing and staging evidence on camera. He said he was on his way and told us to keep her there if possible. Mark took that as his cue to strike up a conversation with her about HOA politics, using his easy charm to stall her while I kept recording. When Daniels arrived 20 minutes later, he took one look at the scene, the boxes, the caution tape, the tote bag, and sighed like a man who'd just been handed paperwork he didn't want but knew was going to be satisfying in the long run. He asked Karen to explain herself, and she launched into a jumbled mess of half-truths, claiming she had seen suspicious deliveries, to my property and was acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. Daniels cut her off, pointing out that not only was she trespassing, but the supposed hazardous materials she had planted were nothing but repurposed grocery boxes and random junk. He made her stand there while he reviewed the footage from my cameras, occasionally glancing up at her with that dry, almost amused expression that meant she was digging herself deeper. When he was done, he informed her that she was being cited for trespassing and warned that any further attempts to interfere with my property could result in arrest. Karen sputtered about being harassed, about the injustice of it all, but Daniels just handed her the citation and told her to collect her belongings and leave. Mark, of course, couldn't resist tossing in a parting comment about how maybe she should focus on her own yard instead of staging crime scenes in mine, which earned him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Once she was gone, Daniels told me privately that he suspected she was unraveling under the pressure, that losing the lawsuit had damaged her standing with the HOA, and she was now grasping at anything to try to regain control. He suggested I keep all the footage handy because he had a feeling this wasn't her last move. After he left, Mark and I gathered up the fake evidence, dumped it in the trash, and reset the security system. Standing there in the cool night air, I couldn't help but think about how far she had fallen in just a few weeks, from strutting into meetings with the confidence of a dictator to sneaking around at midnight with a bag of empty boxes. But I also knew that desperate people could still be dangerous, and if she thought she had one last card to play, she'd try to use it. The difference now was that every step she took was being watched, recorded, and filed away, and the next time she crossed the line, there would be no getting out of it with a half-baked excuse. As I turned off the porch light and went back inside, I had the strange but satisfying sense that the endgame was finally approaching, and if she wanted to make one last stand, I was more than ready to meet her head-on. It was 3 days after the midnight trespassing fiasco when Karen made what would turn out to be her last and most ill-fated move, and it came on a bright Saturday morning that was so quiet you could almost believe the whole feud had burned itself out. I was on the porch reading when I heard the low, steady hum of an engine idling too close to my gate, and when I looked up, there it was. Karen's SUV, freshly washed, gleaming in the sun like she'd driven it straight out of a dealership photo shoot, parked nose to nose with my gate in a way that told me this wasn't a casual visit. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the wheel with both hands, before suddenly throwing it into gear and lurching forward until the front tires kissed the line just before the spike. She paused there, clearly waiting for me to notice, and when I didn't move, she rolled down the window and shouted something about this being her final warning, to open the gate or face consequences. I stayed silent, sipping my coffee, which seemed to irritate her enough that she revved the engine hard and inched forward again. It was then I realized she wasn't just here to posture, she was actually going to try blocking my driveway again, daring me to do something about it. The problem for her was that in the days since her midnight stunt, I had upgraded the spike trap, reinforcing it with a steel plate beneath the spikes so that instead of just puncturing tires, it would collapse the entire front suspension of anything foolish enough to roll over it. Karen clearly hadn't done her homework. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, the SUV bouncing as it rolled onto the trap, and the sound that followed was a deep, sickening crunch that no amount of money or mechanics could fix on the spot. The front end dropped sharply, the frame groaning as the spikes bit deep and the reinforced plate twisted the undercarriage out of shape. Her engine sputtered under the sudden angle, and for a moment there was only the sound of metal settling into its new, very broken position. Karen's expression went from smug satisfaction to open-mouthed horror as she realized she wasn't just dealing with a couple of flat tires this time. Her SUV was immobile, crippled in a way that would require a tow, a full suspension replacement, and probably a very awkward conversation with her insurance company. I set my coffee down, stood, and started walking toward the gate just as Mark's truck pulled up behind me, having gotten Linda's quick text that, "It's happening again." By the time I reached the gate, Linda herself had appeared on her front porch across the street, phone out, recording every second with the kind of focus usually reserved for breaking news. Karen scrambled out of the driver's seat, pointing furiously at the trap and shouting about malicious upgrades and proper